It was 1874. The lifeless body of a man was found, his skull brutally crushed and his throat slashed. Little did the residents of Labette County in Kansas know this sinister event was not an isolated act, but was the beginning of a nightmarish tale that would haunt the region for years to come. This is the story of America's first family of serial killers, the Bloody Benders. Hey y'all, I'm Christina and you're listening to History and Hearsay. Today's story was suggested by a listener. I had actually just started working on my case for this week when I got the suggestion and I looked it up, and so I decided to go ahead and do this story first. So thank you to Jaybird4281 for your support and for today's story suggestion. In the 19th century, Kansas was said to be a pretty bloody place, especially in the years leading up to the Civil War, when free soilers and pro-slavery proponents duked it out for control of their new territory. Free soilers, or the Free State Party as they were also called, were a group of anti-slavery settlers who fought to stop the expansion of slavery in the western territories in the United States. This party was active from 1848 until 1854, when they eventually merged into the Republican Party. To help develop the American West and spur economic growth, Congress passed the Homesteading Act of 1862, which provided 160 acres of federal land to anyone who agreed to farm the land. This act distributed millions of acres of western land to individual settlers. After the Civil War, the U.S. relocated the Osage Indians from Labette County to a new Native American territory in Oklahoma, and the land they left behind drew many pioneers westward to claim their 160 acres. Many of the popular trails that these pioneers took went through Kansas, and these trails were considered extremely dangerous, and Kansas kept its bloody reputation as battlefield-hardened men continued their violence along the trails and in the many cow towns along the way. And in addition to these hardened criminals, travelers also had to be concerned about being attacked by Native Americans. Southwest Kansas was known as a particularly rough area, and in the 1870s, this area got an even tougher reputation as people began disappearing at an alarming rate. No one could have expected that these disappearances could have been connected to some of their very own. Enter the Bender family, a pioneer family that came to claim their share of land. The Bender family consisted of John Bender Sr., his wife Elvira, their son John Jr., and their daughter Kate. When our story begins in 1871, John Sr. was said to have been about 60 years old. He was a wild-looking man who stood over 6 foot tall and had bushy eyebrows and a very unpleasant demeanor. He was seen as a brute, mostly due to the fact that he spoke very little English, and when he did speak, it was mostly unintelligible grunts. Elvira was said to be about 55 years old, and she was also known for being extremely unfriendly, to the point that her neighbors started to refer to her as She-Devil. Neighbors believed that she also spoke very little English. The son, John Jr., was said to have been about 25 years old. He was tall with a lean build, ruddy and handsome. While he was fluent in English, he spoke with a heavy German accent. And in contrast to his parents, John was known to be very social. However, he was prone to random fits of laughter, which led people to believe that he was a half-wit, which is old-timey speak for mentally disabled. The daughter Kate was said to have been about 23 years old. She also spoke fluent English, but she had only a slight German accent. She was known as an extremely friendly and attractive young woman. Kate was also a spiritualist. Now, we talked about spiritualism in my video about ghost photography, but if you're not familiar with it, spiritualism was the belief that one could commune with the dead through the use of a medium, which is someone who was said to possess psychic powers. Kate was a self-proclaimed healer and psychic who held seances, claimed to cure illnesses, and also gave lectures on spiritualism. She advertised these lectures in the local papers and quickly became well known in the area, not only for her beauty, but also for the wild ideas that she would convey through these lectures. Though occultism wasn't necessarily unusual at the time, Kate's advocacy of free love earned her particular notoriety and drew lots of fans to the Bender property, but more on that little piece later. She also spoke about her thoughts on murder, how she thought that maybe it wasn't such a bad thing, and she said that maybe murder was actually a brave and noble act. Not sure what the context of that was, but that was one of the beliefs she was known for spreading around. It was believed that Kate craved fame, wealth, and power. And while she did become very popular, like I said, there were those who worried that her behavior was satanic. This meant that most neighbors steered clear of the Benders and didn't really try to befriend them, which may have actually been the point. While Kate's wild ideas and lectures brought in a crowd, probably more of like a morbid curiosity type of thing, but also I'm sure there were some true believers in what she had to say, especially the spiritualism movement, which was really having its moment around this time. Oddly enough, John Jr. and Kate attended Sunday school at Harmony Grove. And unlike their parents who stayed to themselves, the siblings appeared to really integrate well with society despite their unusual behaviors. When the Benders first arrived in Kansas, they constructed a small cabin and a barn with a corral. Both John Sr. and John Jr. claimed 160 acres of land from the government, but the family only ever lived and worked on John Sr.'s land. The cabin they built was a simple one-room structure that was segmented with a large canvas cloth that allowed them to have two separate spaces in the home. They used the back space for living quarters, and the front was converted into a general store with a kitchen and dining area. A crude sign hung above their front door advertising groceries. The Bender homestead was perfectly situated along the trail, and it was seen as a refuge for pioneers venturing the Osage Mission Independence Trail. That is a mouthful. A place where they could get supplies, a hot meal, and even a safe place to stay overnight. Many a traveler came and went from the Bender's general store, spending the night in the area of land near the vegetable patch and orchard. Some sources say that there was also a bed that the Benders had put inside the general store that was on the other side of the canvas from where the family slept for anyone who wished to sleep indoors. But Bender Inn wasn't the safe haven it pretended to be. Now, as I mentioned earlier, at this time, it was relatively common that travelers would go missing, but in the early 1870s, people began to disappear at an alarming rate. And by 1873, the trail near the Bender's cabin began to garner a reputation for the disappearance of travelers. And this is when people began to completely avoid this trail altogether. The first body was found in May 1871. A man named Jones was found dead in Drum Creek. His skull had been smashed and his throat had been slit from ear to ear. The owner of Drum Creek was initially suspected of the murder, but no action was ever taken on that. I'm thinking maybe there was like a lack of evidence other than him just being found on the guy's land. In February 1872, two more bodies turned up with the same injuries as poor Mr. Jones. By the fall of that year, travelers had started to disappear off the Osage Trail, and reports of the murdered and missing soon spread throughout the region. And it was at this point that the travelers began avoiding the routes altogether. Meanwhile, vigilante groups tried with little success to hold someone accountable. Oftentimes, they would arrest innocent men and end up having to release them. But it was the disappearance of one particular man by the name of George Newton Longcore that set in motion a series of events that would eventually expose the truth about these mysterious disappearances and deaths. After the death of his wife, Longcore and his 8-year-old daughter, Mary Ann, left Independence, Kansas for Iowa, but they never made it. George Longcore had a former neighbor by the name of Dr. William Henry York. Dr. York was the one who actually sold Longcore his horses and wagon to take the trip. And so when that team of horses was actually found abandoned near Fort Scott, Kansas, Dr. York was contacted about these horses. And so he knew that was not a good sign. So in spring of 1873, Dr. York set out to look for his friend. He questioned homesteaders along the trail as he made his way to Fort Scott, where he then identified that the wagon and the horses were, in fact, the ones he had sold Longcore. And he also identified clothes and belongings found in the wagon as having belonged to the father and daughter. But Dr. York would never return from his search. On his way back to Independence, he had made the fatal decision of stopping at the Bender Inn. Now, what the Benders didn't realize is that they had just messed with the wrong family. Dr. York came from a very prominent family. His two brothers were Colonel Ed York, who had served in the Civil War, and Alexander M. York, who was a member of the Kansas State Senate. And when their brother did not return, they weren't just going to sit idly by and not do anything about it, obviously. So Colonel York quickly organized a search party of 75 men to begin the search for Dr. York. And by March 1873, Colonel York and his men were able to track Dr. York's movements to the Bender Inn. And so Colonel York went to have a little chat with the Benders. In this initial meeting, some say the Benders completely denied any knowledge of Dr. York, while others say that the Benders actually admitted to him that, oh yeah, Dr. York had stayed there with them, but that he had went on his way and they hadn't seen him since. Either way, both accounts agreed that the Benders suggested to Colonel York that perhaps his brother had run into some issues with some Native Americans, because they said that John Jr. had actually run into some issues of being shot at in a remote location near Drum Creek right around the same time that Dr. York had disappeared. So whatever the Benders actually said to Colonel York, they must have been pretty convincing, because it said that he stayed and had dinner with them after he was finished questioning them. Around the same time, neighboring communities began to accuse Osage Township of being responsible for all of these disappearances, and so this led the township to call a meeting in the Harmony Grove Schoolhouse in March of 1873. Roughly 75 people attended that meeting, including Colonel York and both Bender men. It was determined that at least 10 people had confirmed to have gone missing from the trail in that area, and the community agreed to obtain search warrants for every property between Big Hill Creek and Drum Creek. During this meeting, many of the men in attendance chimed in, offering to be a part of the search team, but it said that the Benders remained silent. Then on April 3rd, Colonel York arrived back at the Benders' homestead with armed men. This time, he confronted the Benders about a woman who had claimed to have fled the Bender Inn after Elvira had threatened her with knives and pistols. When York began questioning the family about this accusation, the two younger Benders brushed it off as a complete misunderstanding. However, Elvira became enraged and started shouting accusations about how this woman had cursed her coffee. She then ordered Colonel York to get off of her property. Wait a minute. Elvira didn't speak English, right? Well, I guess the gig's up with that one. Then, as Colonel York was leaving, Kate Bender chases after him and tries to convince him to come back later, but come alone, because she said if he comes by himself, she could use her clairvoyance to help Dr. York find his brother's grave. So at this point, Colonel York is like, yeah, I'm pretty sure these people are the ones responsible for my brother's death. Now, it's reported that the men who were with Colonel York, they were completely convinced that the Benders were to blame as well, and they were ready to go ahead and just string them all up right there. But Colonel York was a man of honor, and so he felt that they actually needed some hard evidence before condemning the Benders. Someone being weird or just lying to you about something random was definitely not proof that these people were responsible for such gruesome crimes. So Colonel York leaves the Bender homestead determined that he's going to find some actual evidence against the Benders. But after only a few days had gone by, one of the neighbors notices that none of the Benders' animals appeared to have been fed for several days. And on closer inspection, it appeared as if the homestead had been abandoned altogether. So he contacted the township, and a search party, including Colonel York, was formed to come and search the property. The cabin was completely empty of food, clothing, and most personal possessions were gone. But what was left in the cabin was a terrible odor. It was the overpowering stench of death, and the men were convinced that there must be dead bodies somewhere in or near the cabin. It didn't take long for the men to discover a trap door in the floor that had been nailed shut. Once they pried open the trap door, they discovered a large hole filled with clotted, rotting blood. But no bodies. But clearly, this amount of blood meant that someone, probably multiple someones, had been murdered here. Time out. I have some questions. This was an active general store, right? So how did no one smell this when they were coming in and out of this building? Like, you know what I mean? Did people not walk in and get knocked in the face with this smell? Only thing I can think is maybe there was, I don't know if there was any kind of chemicals that existed back in that day they could have sprinkled or dumped down into the hole every day. I don't know. What do you guys think? If you know any explanation for that, let me know in the comments down below. But the only explanation that makes sense to me is that the Benders were doing something to keep the smell at bay, and it was only this overpowering at this point because they had been gone for at least a week or more from the property, and so no one was doing anything. I don't know. Either way, gross. So then the men were like, okay, well, there's got to be bodies somewhere if there's this much blood. So they wanted to search underneath the cabin. And so the men that were searching for the bodies actually kind of like picked the cabin up and like moved it over in order to make it real easy to dig there. But there were no bodies found under the cabin. So they decided to expand their search and they started poking this long metal rod like in the ground all around the cabin. And once they got to the area that the Benders used as a vegetable patch and orchard, the searchers quickly discovered the first corpse, which was none other than Dr. William York. Buried in a shallow grave, it's said that his feet were barely even covered up by the dirt. His skull had been smashed with blunt force, and his throat had been cut from ear to ear. Over the next several days, 9 more bodies were discovered, along with several dismembered body parts that didn't belong to any of the previously uncovered 10 bodies. The intact remains belonged to 8 men, 1 woman, and 1 little girl. The little girl, of course, was George Longcore's daughter, as his remains were also discovered in the area. The little girl had multiple injuries, such as broken bones, but she was the only victim who didn't have the classic head wound, and none of her injuries were severe enough to have caused her death, so it's believed that she was actually buried alive. As gruesome as all of this is, I feel like this is the worst part. Like, what kind of monster would do that to kids? Like, at least the adults' deaths were pretty quick, right? Oh my goodness. It's just so horrific. The Kansas City Times reported, the little girl was probably 8 years of age and had long, sunny hair and some traces of beauty on her countenance that was not yet entirely disfigured by decay. They went on to list each of her injuries, which are completely heartbreaking. I'm going to spare you guys the details, but it sounds like she probably went through a pretty horrific experience. I kind of feel like, why do the newspapers feel the need to like give all those graphic details? I don't know. I almost feel like for the family's sake, for the little girl's sake, like those kind of details should just be kept private. But I mean, maybe they were just trying to let people know how serious it was. I know that morbid things sell newspapers. I'm sure fear sells newspapers, just like we see now in the media. If they have something they can try to scare you with, they're going to be getting as much content out of that as they can, right? So maybe that's all it was, but I don't know. It just seems wrong to me. It's almost like exploitive, I guess. The Times went on to say, nothing like this sickening series of crimes has ever been recorded in the whole history of the country. Several of the bodies and various remains were never identified, and there were even said to be 4 additional bodies that were found in Drum Creek. So this mystery gets even a little bit more mysterious when you hear some of the common rumors that were going around about the Bender family. While the Benders lived together as a family, there were many speculations about whether or not they were actually a family. No documentation was ever seen to confirm their identities nor their true country of origin. It was assumed that the family was from Germany simply because of the fact that they all spoke German and had German accents. But John Sr. was also speculated to have possibly been from the Netherlands or Norway, and is believed that his original surname was possibly Flickinger. There was also a Bible found in the cabin, which was one of the few personal items left when the searchers arrived, but all of the writing in this Bible was in German, and it identified John Jr. as John Gebhardt. Elvira Bender was believed to have originally gone by the surname Hill, and is believed that she actually had been married several times before John, but her previous husbands have passed away. There was also speculation that she had anywhere between 5 and 12 children, with Kate being her youngest child. Additionally, it is believed that Elvira was also a practicing spiritualist, and it's said that 2 of her previous husbands had died from mysterious deaths. To add a little bit into the mix here, some of the Benders' neighbors believed that Kate and John Jr. were not actually siblings, but they were husband and wife. And as part of that theory, people believed that Kate was actually Elvira's daughter, but that John was not blood related to the rest of the family at all. Which I kind of wonder, if this is the case, why do they feel the need to hide that, right? Like, I don't know if that would have been seen as weird or unusual in the 1800s for a family to be living together. Like, I almost don't feel like that would have been that abnormal, but I don't know. You guys let me know if you're aware. Is that something that would have raised suspicion? Because to me, it doesn't seem like something that would be that unusual. Now, if you want to hear the gross theory that's out there, that theory is that John Jr. and Kate actually were siblings, but that they were still together. which is not something we even want to think about. But this theory suggests that John Jr. and Kate were both of Irish children, but they were from two different marriages, meaning they would have been half siblings who had different fathers, and their real names were Eliza Griffith and John Gebhardt. Now, most researchers I've found that have written books and stuff on this topic seem to believe that John and Kate were probably actually just like a married couple through common law marriage, and they were just posing as siblings. But some of the things that Kate said when she was talking about free love lectures kind of makes you wonder about the sibling theory, because some of the stuff that Kate was quoted as having said was a bit odd and definitely gross. When advocating for free love, Kate said that staying with one partner alone was just the miserable requirements of self-constituted society. The free love movement that Kate was a part of was an actual group of people who advocated for no more government involvement in love-related actions like marriage, relationships, and even adultery, because back in those days, adultery was actually considered a crime, and those who did it would make the papers, publicly shaming the family name. But Kate and other members of this movement were against all government involvement in the act of love, and this was obviously a super wild and scandalous idea for the time period. Notably, she also once said in one of her lectures, "Shall we confine ourselves to a single love and deny our natures their proper sway? Even though it be a brother's passion for his own sister, I say, it shall not be smothered." And this is why the Benders didn't have very many friends. As you can imagine, folks that lived near the Benders were somewhat apprehensive about making friends with them. I mentioned that earlier, but this is just a whole nother layer. Based on a thorough sweep of the Benders' cabin and conversations with those who had come into direct contact with the Benders over the years, it's believed that they kind of know exactly how the Benders would carry out their murders. So, all the older Benders were known for being extremely unfriendly, and the younger Benders, though friendly, were very strange. When it came to their customers, it said that all four Benders were extremely charming. They started by welcoming a guest who was looking to stay the night with absolute warmth and kindness. They would insist on cooking the guest a warm meal, and then they would insist that the guest sat at the head of the table, which during this time period was considered an act of great kindness by the head of the household, because apparently it was some type of honor to sit at the head of the table. They, however, had an obvious ulterior motive. The seat of honor was situated right above that trap door. Kate was said to have been a big part of the plan. She would often use her beauty and charm to question travelers without raising suspicion. She would quickly figure out how wealthy the person was and if they had any family that would come looking for them should they go missing. Once she had determined that they were a suitable victim, she would convince them to stay for dinner. Then, once placed at the seat of honor, she would continue to distract them with delightful conversation, or if that wasn't working, she would even use her body. Sounds like your girl might have been showing off some ankles. I don't know. She was pretty scandalous. Not only was the seat of honor situated above the trapdoor, it was also right in front of the tarp that was used to partition the living quarters from the general store. And once the customer was seated with their back to the tarp, and Kate had them all nice and distracted, one of the Bender men would sneak up from behind the curtain and strike the guest on the head with a hammer. The victim's throat would then be slit from ear to ear by either Kate or Elvira, and the trapdoor would be open, allowing the body to drop into the hole, or the remains would then be stripped for any valuables and would kind of just be hidden there until nighttime when they could bury the body. During the investigation, after the Benders had fled and they were searching the cabin and all of that, the search party found that the cabin was riddled with bullet holes, which seemed to indicate that some victims possibly attempted to fight back after initially being hit with the hammer. Now, the reason we have all of these details and how all this went down is because, fortunately for them, some of the Benders' guests made it out alive, and all of the ones that came forward testified to this exact story and kill method. One man claimed that he had intended to have dinner with the Benders, but when he refused their offer to sit at the head of the table because he didn't want to put his back against the nasty tarp, apparently was covered with disgusting stains. So when he refused to sit there, Kate actually threatened him with a knife, at which point he was an intelligent man, so he just fled from the cabin. There was also a Catholic priest who came forward and said that he had been in the Benders' cabin, but but he noticed that one of the Bender men was concealing what appeared to be a sledgehammer, so he too hightailed it out of there. Apparently, the Benders weren't replacing that canvas cloth. Like I said, there were so many stains on it, like blood stains and stuff. And so this started to make guests who would come in uneasy, and they'd be more reluctant to sit at the head of the table. People started insisting on like, yeah, I'll eat dinner with you guys, but I'm going to sit here at the counter. Like they wouldn't even go over the table or anything like that. And some of them took one look at that canvas and hightailed it the other direction because they're like, something weird going on here. Not staying for dinner, which was probably a much smarter idea. So there's a lot of confusion when it comes to the motive of these killings because the obvious motive seems to be money, like they were going to rob these people, right? But while some of their victims were very wealthy and carrying a lot of cash and valuables with them, other victims didn't seem to have much of value with them at all. And so the suggestion has been made over the years that the Benders were just crazies who killed for the thrill of it. And this definitely could be the case. I mean, they did some pretty heinous things, especially if you consider that poor little girl. But I also saw a theory that made a lot more sense to me. And that is that maybe this was motivated by money, but instead of cash and valuables, they were actually stealing horses. I mean, everyone who was on the trail had to have a horse, right? Like it doesn't matter how rich or poor you are, you'd have to have a horse. And horses were pretty valuable back in those days. So it would make sense that they attacked wealthy and poor if they were going after the horses. And then the wealthy people would just have like bonus items for them to steal, right? It's hard when these stories are like 100 plus years old because there's little missing pieces and it's almost impossible to fully unravel exactly what happened here. Which theory makes the most sense to you? If you're watching this on YouTube, leave me a comment down below and let me know. In the wake of the gruesome discovery made at the Benders' property, both State Senator Alexander York and Kansas Governor Thomas A. Osborne offered substantial rewards for the apprehension of the family. Detectives followed wagon tracks to find the family's horses who'd been abandoned outside a fair 12 miles north of the inn. From there, it's kind of hard to tell what's real and what's urban legend. Some say that John Jr. and Kate traveled by railroad to an outlaw colony near the border of Texas and New Mexico, where law enforcement wouldn't go. One detective even claimed that he tracked John Jr. down to the border and found that he died of some type of stroke. Meanwhile, there were reports that Elvira and John Sr. had fled towards St. Louis, Missouri. For many years after the crimes, if two women were traveling together, they would get accused of being Kate and Elvira Bender. And although several vigilante groups would claim to have caught and killed the Benders, none provided evidence or claimed the cash reward. In 1884, an elderly man, who investigators say matched the description of John Sr. Bender, was arrested in Idaho for a murder committed with a hammer. While waiting for more details from Kansas, the man tried to escape by severing his own foot. He ended up bleeding to death and decomposing before an identification could be made. In 1889, a mother, Almira, and daughter, Sarah Elizabeth, were arrested for larceny in Michigan and subsequently accused of being Elvira and Kate Bender. But when they were brought to Kansas, a panel from Labette County that was meant to confirm their identity provided inconsistent results. So with significant doubt of their identity as the Benders, the women were released and sent back to Michigan. So it appears as though the Benders themselves were actually never held accountable for these murders, but there were others that were punished for their crimes. 12 men in total were charged as accessories for helping dispose of the stolen goods. This included Mitch Cherry, a member of the vigilante committee, who was revealed to have forged a letter to one of the victims' wives saying that he had arrived safely at his destination. The fact that it was proven that the Benders had outside help kind of seems like the whole horse thief theory makes some sense because none of the other horses other than Mr. Longcore's were ever found. Like that was one of the mysteries to investigators about the story, is that they were never able to just figure out where all these people's horses and wagons and stuff had gone. So maybe they did have some outside help selling and getting rid of these horses. It is believed that the two elder Benders split off from the two younger ones at some point in their journey, which definitely would have made it easier for them to go undetected, especially since John Jr. and Kate seemed to have a much better time of fitting in with society. Regardless, it seemed as though the Benders had vanished into thin air. I personally kind of wonder if all 4 of the Benders had like put on personas, and it just seems like they were so weird they could go somewhere and be normal and no one would know who they are. We already know that Elvira was lying about being able to speak English, and it kind of makes you wonder, was Kate even a spiritualist? Maybe John Jr. wasn't the bumbling, laughing idiot that he appeared to be. Kate could have gone off and pretended to be a quiet, pious woman, and no one would ever match that person to the description of Kate Bender, right? Like, I don't know. Just my thoughts. The story of their escape remains a puzzle, and their ultimate fate is a mystery. The Benders claimed the lives of at least 10 people, but it seems quite possible that they had as many as 21 victims, assuming all the bodies found in the creek could be attributed to them. And it really appears as though this family actually got away with this. The fate of the Benders is surrounded in folklore, and separating what's true from fiction is difficult. But there is one theory that is so intriguing that I have to discuss it with you guys. So, about 15 years after all of this happened with the Benders, another serial killer family comes onto the scene. This family, the Kelly family, was made up of a mother, a father, a son, and a daughter, just like the Benders. Additionally, this family also lured travelers into their inn for dinner, and they also had a trap door below their table. Speculation at the time that this all was happening about whether or not the Benders and the Kellys were the same people was rampant. An unnamed man from Kansas City had deeply investigated the bloody Benders, and he stated that all the story of the Benders' capture and death were complete lies. He also said that the Kelly family used the same specific MO as the Benders, and he thought that they had to be the same people. But it's also highly possible that the Kellys were just copycat killers, because the newspapers had recorded and shared every gruesome detail with the public from the Benders' crimes. But one of the main arguments against the Benders and the Kellys actually being the same family is that a newspaper article from the time gave the ages of the Kellys' children as being 18 and 20 at the time of their crimes, which if that was their actual ages, they couldn't have been the Benders, because then they'd have only been like 3 and 5 at the time of the Benders' crimes. So unless the ages of the Kelly children were printed wrong in the newspaper, which is certainly a possibility in an era when there were no census and birth certificates weren't popular, it's probably more likely that the Kellys were simply copycat killers who followed the stories in the newspaper. But how crazy would it be if this was actually them? Fortunately, because of the popularity of the previous case of the Benders, when the Kellys came onto the scene, justice was swift. People were not playing around, and the family was killed after being pursued by a group of vigilantes. Sadly, they still managed to claim the lives of at least 11 victims in just a matter of a few months. As the story of the Benders spread across the country in the years following the murder spree, thousands of tourists and souvenir hunters flocked to the Benders' former homestead, looting the property. The cabin disappeared piece by piece from curious collectors who literally carried the place away brick by brick and board by board until there was nothing left. The Benders quickly found a place in local legend, with many believing the property was haunted. Ghost apparitions and moaning sounds would be reported as having come from the place where the Bender cabin once stood. In 1961, a Bender Museum was created in the nearby town of Cherryville, 7 miles southwest of the old Bender homestead. This museum received 3 of the Benders' actual hammers in 1967, and the museum was a replica of the original cabin, and they showed how things would have been done. In its first 3 days of opening, this museum attracted more than 2,000 visitors. However, this museum was closed down in 1978 due to the fact that people didn't really want their town to be known for the Bender family's horrific crimes. So instead of having a place completely dedicated to the Benders, the artifacts, including the hammers, the photos, newspaper clippings, and all of that, they were all relocated to the Cherryville Historical Museum, where you can still see them today at 215 East 4th Street. The museum has a wall dedicated to the Benders, which, looking at the pictures, this museum appears to be pretty tiny, so I'm betting that this attraction is what most people are coming there to see. Several different museums have claimed to have the knife from the crimes or the hammers from the homestead over the years, but the hammers in Cherryville are believed to be the actual ones due to the fact that the exact chain of custody can be traced directly from the guy who was at the scene during the initial search, got the hammers and put them in his saddlebag, and then eventually over time it was passed passed down until it went to the initial museum. Now, one other interesting side note, Mr. Longcord, the victim who had the little girl, it turns out that he had actually been a neighbor of the Ingalls family, which you may know is the family that were made famous by the Little House on the Prairie television series. Laura Ingalls Wilder, the author of the Little House on the Prairie books, she's told many stories of people she knew that had actually stopped at their inn. And she also has shared like what it was like to be hearing all the news of what had happened in real time. Her father, Pa Ingalls, joined a vigilante group that had attempted to hunt down the Benders for the reward money. In her autobiography, Pioneer Girl, Laura said that she'd come to her own conclusion as to what Pa meant when he said the family would never be found. While the fate of the Bender family may never truly be known, the sensational tales and rumors of the Benders continued well into the 20th century. But what happened to them remains one of the greatest unsolved mysteries of the Old West. So, what do you guys think? Let me know all of your theories down below. I can't wait to read them, and I'll catch y'all in the next one. Crabbing? What?
Can I do PS Kids? Got it.
Go duck under that. Duck under that. Okay, go out and close the door. They started by welcoming. Oh my gosh, why can I not talk? Birds are so hard. I also thought